DOD's efforts to improve payment and funds control. Previous hearings have covered DOD's efforts to improve financial management, achieve audit readiness. Improving financial management controls is critical to safeguarding taxpayer dollars and preventing waste, fraud, and abuse. Today we'll examine the Department's efforts to address improper payments, Anti-Deficiency Act violations, and other types of disbursements that increase the risk of fraudulent or erroneous payments and impact the ability to report reliable information on our financial statements. Billions of taxpayer dollars are wasted each year when the federal government makes payments in incorrect amounts to the wrong entities and to entities that are not eligible to receive those payments. In fiscal 2010, the federal agencies reported an estimated $125 billion in improper payments, of which $1 billion was reported by the Department of Defense. Under any other circumstance, $1 billion would be considered a staggering amount. Yet both the DOD Office of Inspector General and GAO have reported that DOD may not be reporting or capturing the full extent of its improper payments. Properly identifying and reporting the amount of improper payments is a critical step on the way to developing actions needed to prevent and recover these payments. The Anti-Deficiency Act prohibits executive agencies from incurring obligations or making expenditures that exceed their appropriations. This is one of the major laws in which major ways in which Congress exercises its constitutional control of the purse. In September 2008, GAO reported that as a result of continuing financial management weaknesses, including difficulties in ensuring the proper authorization, processing, and recording of payments, DOD's ability to timely and reliably determine the amounts of funds that it has available to spend is impaired, and the Department remains at risk of over-obligating and overspending its appropriations in violations of the Anti-Deficiency Act. In fact, according to GAO, DOD reported 64 ADA violations from fiscal 2007 through mid-September 2011, totaling about $927 million. DOD has taken actions to improve its financial management system, yet as illustrated by the examples, certain examples, there is still much work to be done. With budget deficits in the trillions, the government can ill afford to not properly account for all of our taxpayer resources because of poor management controls. I want to thank our witnesses in advance for their testimony. We have today Mark Easton, Deputy Chief Financial Officer for the Department of Defense. We've got Daniel Blair, Deputy Inspector General for Auditing, Department of Defense, and Asif Khan, Director of Financial Management and Assurance from the GAO. Now let's turn to Rob Andrews for any comments he wants to make.
Chairman, good morning. I'd like to thank you and our colleagues for assembling a really first-rate panel. We've heard from all three of these gentlemen various iterations over the last couple of years, and I look forward to this morning's testimony. I think the chairman set the context exactly right for this discussion. If you exclude the OCO accounts, the overseas accounts in Iraq and Afghanistan, and you look at real dollar defense budgets, the defense budget's 40% higher than it was in 2001 in real dollars. We have essentially the same end strength, the same number of ships, the same number of airplanes, which sort of begs the question, where's this money and what have we gotten for it? Now, I don't think there's a preordained right answer to what the level should be. Actually, the best answer I've ever heard was given by then Marine Commandant General Krulak a few years ago before the committee when someone asked him what he would do with the last dollar he had to spend. And he said, I would spend it on, after he or she has completed their mission successfully, bringing my last Marine home safely. Pretty good answer, I thought. So with that spirit in mind, in looking at this 40% real growth over time, we have a lot of important decisions to make. We can't make good decisions without accurate data, and we can't have accurate data without auditable financial statements. The chairman talked about the alarming level of inappropriate payments. When I say inappropriate, I don't mean necessarily criminal or nefarious, but paying too much for the right thing or paying something for the wrong thing. And so I think I know we've assembled three individuals that have great expertise in addressing this problem and pointing us in the right direction. And Mr. Chairman, I'm looking forward to hearing what they have to say and then engaging with our colleagues in some good questions to further edify the effort. So good morning. I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, thanks, Rob. One quick anecdote. I was on a trip last week out in the Hitherlands at a DOD facility. We'd finished the tour, and a couple of the guys who had leading the tour were walking. The three of us were walking off, and they were having a brief conversation. And I wouldn't pay much attention, but the phrase ERP came into their conversation. It's between those two, and so I kind of stepped into it. I said, "What are you guys talking about?" And they were talking about they were going to, over the next 3 or 4 weeks, they were going to have to put in an extensive amount of work to get converted to whatever the ERP thing they were working on. And I said, "Well, what do you think about that?" And they were very complimentary. They had no reason to know I had a keen interest in it. And they said, it's going to be better on the other side. It'll help us do our work better. And so, Mark, you pass on to the rest of the squad. It's filtering all the way down to buy-in by folks who are actually having to, at the point end of that sword, to have to put it together. And so I was very encouraged by their comments that they were sold out at the advantages of getting it done in their particular deal. So with that, Mark, you want to start us this morning?
Thank you, sir. Chairman Conaway, Ranking Member Andrews, members of the panel, thank you for your continued interest in DOD financial management and for providing me an opportunity to relate it to issues like improper payments, problem disbursements, and Anti-Deficiency Act violations. I submitted a more detailed statement for the record, but in the interest of time, I'll summarize briefly so that we'll have as much time as possible for questions. As the Deputy Chief Financial Officer, my responsibilities at DOD involve financial policies, systems compliance, and internal controls, among a lot of other things. I've dealt with these kinds of things in various capacities in the field, both in uniform and as a civil servant and in the field particularly, and so I appreciate your comments relative to getting the word out. I'm proud to be part of a financial management workforce that is supporting the warfighter around the world, but I'm also mindful of our stewardship responsibility and the fact that DOD financial management has remained on the GAO high-risk list since 1995. My experience tells me that a reasonable level of controls do exist within DOD, especially in the local control of assets and expenditure of funds, but my current position also provides me with a broader perspective that must acknowledge enterprise-wide weaknesses that negatively impact our financial management capabilities and demand an enterprise-wide response. The lack of auditable financial statements are clearly a symptom of those weaknesses. As we've talked to you many times in this forum, DOD has a challenging business environment, a combination of size, complexity, and geographical dispersion. How well we manage within that environment depends on how well the people, processes, and systems that have to deal with that interact and work together. People are really the key, particularly now. We have a dedicated and experienced workforce, and we rely heavily on those traits of dedication and technical expertise. We depend on them not only to support today's mission, which has been expanding over the last 10 years particularly, and to deal with today's problems, but also to be able to acquire new skills and to lead change throughout the enterprise. Another key business element is processes, and this is an area that I think you're going to hear a lot of issues across the board, but the one thing that we do agree on is the need for increased and improved internal controls, more standard processes. That is the key to be able to produce higher quality financial information for both reporting and decision making. And the third factor, Mr. Chairman, is the one you mentioned about ERPs. Clearly, our size and complexity demands that we have automated, integrated systems. It's key to particularly being able us to support auditability and sustain those changes. The bottom line is that a stronger business environment is really the key. It will reduce the likelihood of improper payments and problem disbursements that we've experienced and minimize the risk of ADA violations. I would assert that we manage these three risk factors well, despite current weaknesses, but we have to do much, much better. Let me highlight each of these areas very briefly. First, improper payments. The Defense Finance and Accounting Service, and you heard from Martha Smith last week, handles about 90% of all our payments. We use post-pay statistical sampling on 5 of the 6 major programs that we have, and we plan to expand, and this is an area of contention, but we plan to expand that to our commercial payment area, post-payment statistical sampling, in addition to be able to act on issues that we receive in terms of notifications from vendors to be able to recapture capture those resources. We use the processes to be able to identify root causes and act on those causes. As you mentioned, the government-wide error rate with $120 billion that are reported of improper payments, we represent roughly half of that as a percentage and about $1 billion. The elements that we are emphasizing for auditability, and this is the linkage that I'll keep coming back to, strong internal controls will further reinforce this program. Turning to problem disbursements, and to try to use a plain English analogy, we have thousands of people writing checks and thousands of individual accounts. One digit or one problem on any one of those transactions oftentimes doesn't prevent that payment from being dispersed, but does prevent it from being able to return and be posted to your checking account. We put problem disbursement, essentially that's what a problem disbursement is. We put problem disbursements into three categories: unmatched, which is a case that we have an obligation and that disbursement cannot find its way back to that obligation, so we have an unmatched condition. The second is something we call a negative unliquidated obligation, which means it did find that original obligation, but the dollar value exceeded that. And then the third, you might refer to it as float in your own checking account, where you've written checks. We call that in transit. Once those in transits reach a particular age, they essentially fall into the categories of a problem disbursements. Across the board, we've made significant progress. For example, in 1999, overage problem disbursements since then have been reduced by 83%. Negative unliquidated obligations have been reduced by 97%. Anti-Deficiency Act violations are another matter. They can occur for a number of reasons: a violation of purpose, time, or amount. We first strive to prevent the occurrences, and as you heard Secretary Hale say, the only right goal for Anti-Deficiency Act violations is zero. But when they do occur, we need to track them, track the ongoing investigation, and make sure that we reach a conclusion and report promptly. Each ADA case is unique, but there are recurring themes, and frequently they reveal a need to increase the level of training and awareness because it's a very, very complex business environment. Over the past 4 years, a total of 123 cases were identified through audits or through self-reporting, and we'd like to do more through self-reporting, having management assume that responsibility. 48 cases were investigated and found to be actual violations and were reported. 37 cases were investigated and found to be no violations, and 38 are currently under investigation as potential violations. It's important to note that it's not. Once we begin an investigation, we may reach the conclusion that it is not a violation in the course of the investigation. We've been able to minimize, and the number of Anti-Deficiency Act violations have been relatively stable despite a very, very porous business environment. Our current emphasis on internal controls as part of our audit readiness program should contribute to timelier identification. That's really the key, and more efficient investigation of those cases. Secretary Hale has placed significant emphasis on ensuring that we're reporting in a more timely manner. We inherited we've reduced the number of overage cases. These are cases that are too old, past the 1-year time frame to investigate and report. We've reduced that number by 60%. In summary, please be assured that my colleagues and I are fully committed to fulfilling our stewardship responsibility to the taxpayer. We recognize the benefits of a stronger and better controlled business environment. One that supports auditable financial statements will increase public confidence in our reporting and will reduce the incidence of improper payments and problem disbursement. Most importantly, they'll provide better information for us to get more out of the program. We are building a business environment, those people, processes, and systems that will attack the causes, not just the symptoms. And finally, we're maintaining a strong working relationship with key stakeholders, to include my colleagues on the panel today, GAO and DOD. Their feedback, while sometimes painful, is important to our overall efforts to strengthen financial management. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement. I sincerely appreciate the time that you and your distinguished panel have invested to better understand our challenges and support our efforts to address them.
All right, thanks, Mark. Daniel?
Chairman Conaway, Ranking Member Andrews, and distinguished members of the panel, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to appear here before you on behalf of the DODIG to talk about improper payments, Anti-Deficiency Act violations, and other problem disbursements. In the current economic environment, it's important for DOD to know that every payment that it makes goes to the right person for the right amount and at the right time. Over the past few years, the Department has worked hard to address its financial management challenges and has recognized that some of the impediments that need to be resolved. However, more progress needs to be made in order to be good stewards of the taxpayers' money. Since fiscal year 2007, DODIG has issued 27 audit reports addressing improper payments. These payments are often the result of unreliable data and poor internal controls, and they create an environment where fraud and waste are more likely. In FY10, the Department reported nearly $1 billion of estimated improper payments. However, we found the Department's process did not review more than half of the FY10 gross outlays. and therefore question the reliability of this estimate. Without strong internal controls, the Department is at risk of making improper payments. For example, our audit of a contract supporting broad area maritime surveillance found that DOD personnel did not validate that the contractor was entitled to receive over $329 million because none of the invoices were reviewed. We also found that the Navy paid this contractor $206,000 for questionable travel expenses, such as a golf outing and air shows in Paris and Singapore. We have concerns about the large number of potential Anti-Deficiency Act, or ADA, violations that are averted because we identify them during the course of our audit, and the Department takes appropriate corrective actions to remedy these situations. Since 2005, we have issued 49 reports that have identified over 900 potential ADA violations, valued at over $2.3 billion, which the Department needed to investigate and resolve. We found that the Department often sends money to other Federal agencies to fulfill contracting needs, and this money may be used beyond the time and purpose limitations of the appropriation. Our audit, a joint audit that we did with the State Department IG recently on the Afghan National Police training efforts, identified almost $75 million in potential ADA violations. Using Defense Department funds, the State Department reobligated funds outside the scope of the reimbursable agreement and moved expired funds to cover new requirements. Fund balance with Treasury reconciliations are a basic control to ensure that all disbursements are properly accounted for, and they help to identify problem disbursements. As you know, generally fund balance with Treasury is similar to a checking account that needs to be reconciled on a regular basis. However, the Department oftentimes struggles to consistently reconcile these accounts, which last year totaled over $521 billion. Currently, 54 other defense organizations share a commingled fund balance with Treasury account and must rely primarily on balances in the cash management report when reconciling to the U.S. Treasury. However, we recently found that the cumulative balances on the cash management report were over $9 billion different than amounts reported by the U.S. Treasury and included $1.45 billion in unmatched transactions. During fiscal year 10, the Marine Corps' financial statement audit of its statement of budgetary resources, the Marine Corps was unable to support its fund balance with Treasury reconciliations. However, starting in June of this year, the Marine Corps has been able to provide detailed transaction files supporting its reconciliation process. So there is an obvious note of improvement that has taken place since the last year's audit. Before closing, I also want to briefly mention 3 key challenges that must be addressed before the Department's financial statements become auditable by the 2017 deadline. These 3 areas are improving data reliability, improving internal controls, and effectively implementing new systems. These challenges must be resolved before this ambitious plan can become a reality. We frequently identify financial data that is incomplete and inaccurate, and as a result, DOD decision makers and other leaders cannot rely on this data to make sound business decisions. The Department also faces pervasive internal control weaknesses that hamper its financial management efforts. While DOD's new systems are a key component of its auditability strategy, unless the Department first improves the quality of the data and re-engineers its processes, many of the intended benefits of these systems will not be realized. In closing, sound financial management is critical to providing effective stewardship over billions of dollars the Defense Department receives annually. While I recognize that there is significant effort that the DOD leadership is putting in at this point to resolve financial management problems, frankly, much more remains to be done. Senior leadership in the Department and other stakeholders, including the Congress, need reliable financial information on a daily basis to ensure that every dollar supports the warfighter and improves military readiness. This concludes my statement, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Daniel. Asa?
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Andrews, and members of the panel, good morning. It is my pleasure to be here today to provide our perspectives on the status of Department of Defense funds control and payment controls. As a steward of public resources, DOD is responsible and accountable for using public funds for the purposes and within the timeframes and amounts prescribed by law, making payments to the right parties in the correct amount, identifying and recouping any improper payments, and accurately recording and reporting on its transactions on the use of public funds. I would like to thank the panel for holding this important hearing. Having assurance that these basic controls and processes are working correctly is a fundamental prerequisite for overall financial reliability and reporting. In my testimony today, I will discuss the weaknesses in DOD's funds control and payment controls and their impact on the reliability of DOD financial information. I will also discuss the Department's efforts to estimate its improper payments. My statement today is based primarily on our prior work. In addition, it includes relevant information from reports issued by the DOD Inspector General. First, regarding funds control. For years, GAO has reported pervasive weaknesses in DOD's controls over its funds and the reliability of its financial reporting. For example, in 2008, like you had mentioned, Mr. Conaway, we had reported that DOD's complex and inefficient payment processes, unintegrated business systems, and weak internal controls impaired its ability to maintain proper funds controls, putting DOD at risk of over-obligating or overspending its appropriations. These conditions have hindered its ability to ensure that transactions are accurately recorded, sufficiently supported, properly executed, and effectively monitored. In other words, at any given time, DOD does not have sufficient, reliable information available to provide assurance that its obligations and disbursements are within budget and legal limits. Funds control weaknesses place DOD at risk of violating the Anti-Deficiency Act, enacted to prevent agencies from incurring obligations or making expenditures in excess or in advance of appropriations. The ADA requires DOD to report on its ADA violations. For the 5-year time period from fiscal year 2007 through September 15, 2011, DOD reported 64 ADA violations with a total dollar amount of just over $927 million. However, DOD's reporting of ADA violations may not be complete as a result of other pervasive internal control weaknesses. In addition, DOD has a category of disbursement it refers to as problem disbursements. They include disbursements paid that have not been matched to their related obligation records as a result of breakdowns in both fund control and payment controls. DOD has been reporting hundreds and millions of dollars in unmatched disbursements over 120 days old in recent fiscal years. Problem disbursement increased the risk of making fraudulent or erroneous payments without detection. In addition, problem disbursement impaired the reliability of DOD financial statements and DOD's ability to control its disbursement, a key aspect of funds control. These and other weaknesses over financial reporting have prevented the military services and DOD overall from preparing reliable statement of budgetary resources, the SBR, since they were first required in 1998. For instance, like Mr. Blair mentioned, the Marine Corps received a disclaimer of opinion on its fiscal year 2010 SBR due to serious control weaknesses. Also, funds control and other weaknesses are currently hindering Navy's audit readiness related to its funds balance with Treasury. Controls over fund balance with Treasuries are similar to reconciling a checkbook with a bank statement and a key step in preparing the SBR. Finally, regarding improper payments, DOD reported for fiscal year 2010 that it made an estimated $1 billion in improper payments. However, these estimates do not include amounts from its commercial payment programs, which account for approximately 1/3 of the value of DOD payments. Our prior work and reports issued by the DOD IG have highlighted the Department's long-standing and significant problems with estimating and preventing improper payments. Specific weaknesses in DOD's payment controls include inadequate payment processing, inadequate support documentation for expenditures, financial systems deficiencies, and also weak contract audit and payment controls. We have also reported on weakness in DOD processes for assessing the risk of improper payments and in reporting estimated amounts of improper payments. In closing, Mr. Chairman, DOD continues to face difficult challenges. If DOD is to achieve its stated goal of audit readiness for its consolidated financial statement by the end of fiscal year 2017, it is critical for the Department to closely monitor its progress. It is also critically important for DOD to focus on the basics such as correctly recording obligations, performing key reconciliations, and making accurate payments. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Members Andrews, and members of this panel, this concludes my prepared statement. I would be happy to answer any questions that you may have at this time. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen. We're going to reverse order on our side. Todd, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of our witnesses for your service and appearance here this morning. I want to direct my line of inquiry to ERP implementation, something all of you touched on at various levels of detail. DOD, we know, is investing billions of dollars in modernizing these business systems, and there have been some challenges, understandably at some level, in terms of implementing these systems in a timely fashion and within budget. It was Mr. Blair, I believe, in his testimony, who said that DOD has been unable to meet key milestones for 4 of the 11 ERP systems in the department. So I am curious what impact you project that any continued slippages will have in terms of the department's efforts to improve its funds control and payment processes, firstly, and then secondarily, what, if anything, is being done and can be done to mitigate those slippages in your interface with the vendors or internally?
One of the things that's important to note is how critical the ERP systems are to the department's fund balance, or not just fund balance, but auditability of all of its statements. And as you noted, some of them have slipped. And I think that because it's such an integral part of the auditability efforts, this slippage is of serious concern. It could have a profound impact upon whether or not the department is able to meet its auditability goal. What we've done at the IG is to increase the number of audits that we're doing of these systems, because what we're starting to see is that there are some consistent themes in LMP, for example, or GFIBs, where some of the same problems exist in those systems where they're not compliant with the standard general ledger, for example. And we're making recommendations to the department to fix these, but also to look at how they're implementing other ERPs so that they can take the lessons learned from one and apply it to all as appropriate.
We appreciate the question. I think that with many, I'd say most of the ERPs, we've still got a couple ERPs from Air Force coming along, but most of the ERPs, we are beginning to more effectively apply lessons learned. And I would look for some of the slippages in schedule to be mitigated, if only for the fact that we're very close to the end of the program in many regards. We're directly linking those things to audit readiness. I'd venture to say that some of our previous experience and some of the causes is the fact that we had the acquisition program delivering a system without the business community fully engaged and being able to link the kinds of things that we talked about. And so I think that we've done a much better job of being able to say, you know, these are the problems that we're trying to solve relative to problem disbursements. Having said that, we're putting these ERPs into an environment that's sort of flawed. And so the interfaces that exist now, hopefully many of them will go away, we'll begin to improve that process as well. So bottom line is that we're getting better, but it's a critical enabler.
You share that assessment, Mr. Khan?
Mr. Young, I just want to mention 2 things as far as the ERP slippages is concerned. The impact is going to be more cost, obviously, because there are cost overruns, and it's going to require more money in terms of using legacy systems. And the impact of using legacy systems on a go-forward basis is going to be on improper payments and ADA violations, because the underlying cause is weak controls. If we continue forward with the legacy systems, it's going to perpetuate the weak controls, causing more improper payments or continuing to have them, and also ADA violations as the status quo.
So to take that to the next level, you say if we continue on with the legacy systems, it would require additional appropriations by Congress, additional investments to move past some of those systems, right? Otherwise, we can experience additional data exchange challenges and corrupt data and whatnot, right? So we're just going to have to weigh that trade-off.
I mean, that's a correct consequence that you've laid out. It's going to cost more to maintain the legacy system, certainly. and operate them. And at the same time, additional money is going to be spent on developing the ERPs.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Todd. Joe, Rob, 5 minutes, or Joe? In spite of rewarding bad behavior, we'll go with Joe Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Over the weekend, I was at an Indian event, a Mohegan Indian event, where they gave me a new name. It's 2 Ironfish instead of 2 subs, so which Mr. Conaway would appreciate that. Mr. Blair, your testimony, you talked about the 27 audits that have taken place since 2007. What triggers those? Is that just sort of random, or is it whistleblower complaints, or is it a regular process? I mean, what? Maybe just help me with that.
Our audits start from a wide variety of sources. Some of them are whistleblowers. Some of them are as a result of our annual planning efforts. Some of them are as a result of outreach to the department, and we ask them, what are your areas of concern? And so we put that all together when we do our annual audit plans. And so that's how we come up with the wide variety of the audits that we do.
So, you know, if we fast forward to 2017 and we get to a place where it is auditable systems, what does that mean for your office? I mean, does that allow you to be less random in terms of trying to find where the problems are?
There is no doubt that when we get to the 2017 date, that we're going to have to approach this with a large number of our resources, and it will reduce the number of audits that we can do in other areas. I do have a fairly large number of staff who are financial statement auditors, and they will be the ones that will be leading the 2017 effort, but it will impact some of the other work that we've been able to do. But what I'm hoping is that as we go forward over the next several years, there will be more and more corrections that will be made, less audits are needed in those other areas, so that we'll be able to focus those resources appropriately on this effort.
So when you, in page 3 of your testimony, talked about, we found that the department's review process included less than half of fiscal 2010's first quarter gross outlays. I mean, help me with, I mean, I read that as saying that basically we don't know about where the other half is in terms of accuracy as far as payments. Is that, and will that change if once we get to 2017, assuming we hit that date?
Well, Mr. East and I were talking about that before we started this morning, and one of the things that we agree on is the need to expand the methodology that they're using to identify improper payments, and to go into those other gross outlays in subsequent years that they didn't look at in fiscal year 10. And the more you look, the more you're going to find. The more you find, the more corrections that can be made to prevent that going forward. So I think that's the ultimate goal.
So the one, well, go ahead, Mr.
Can I follow up? Yeah, on that particular issue? I guess going back to your broad question, in 2017, I would like to see an environment where management assumes responsibility for those internal controls. I would like to be able to go to Dan and say, you're going to have to put your resources in a financial audit. That will mean, because we have recognized and acknowledged and implemented controls so that you don't have to make these specific kind of things. On that particular issue of improper payments, and this was an issue that, quite frankly, we did not agree with. The segment of outlays that was in the testimony were intragovernmental outlays, essentially, and some in the intelligence community that were not included, and we did not plan to include those. And so there was a difference of opinion there. There's much that we agree on in that particular area that we did not agree. But an audit will allow us to be able to combine the internal control perspective, the coverage perspective, so that we don't have these disagreements in the future.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the panel coming in this morning. Having been in business for about 25 years, I've certainly been embarrassed from time to time to learn that our business had overpaid a vendor twice, and I'll even confess that in our campaign in the blur of life, we also paid twice there on occasion. So when you look at the magnitude of the Department of Defense, it is not at all surprising that this is a challenge. Having said that, the testimony this morning, and particularly Mr. Blair, for some reason I just focused in on what you both said and what you've written in your testimony. There's a part of me that gets extremely frustrated as a fellow American to hear this, and the business side of me says, hey, what a great opportunity to make things better. there's no shortage of places to look. I share your view that we've severely, in some cases, understated the amount of overpayment. And at some point, if you could, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but if you could help us quantify that, what your view is, what, if it's not $1 billion in the DOD, what is it? It's certainly higher. One thing that seems to be absent in the reports that we're hearing this morning is tying in accountability. This is going to be a common theme that I'm going to bring pretty much each and every session. When we read about these overpayments, and I'm not looking for a scapegoat, I'm not looking to just fire someone to fire someone, but there does seem to be a lack of accountability of the personnel. And we need to say, is it that the process has not been clearly communicated? Have we not trained our people well? Or if we've done all of that and we just have some people who are not performing well, have we held them accountable? There is a sense, and this is just in the as a fellow American here, that our government is not holding people accountable. We want to promote the people who are doing well, reward them, have a more of an entrepreneurial approach in government, and also work with, and if necessary, fire someone who is not performing well. So, Mr. Blair, if you could comment, please, on what are the barriers to better performance? Is it the resources that we're not funding our auditors enough? Because it seems to me you'd get a good marginal return on allocating more money to this, certainly with the numbers that I've seen. And then please comment on the accountability part, both for our personnel and for the vendors who deliberately are stealing from the American taxpayer.
With regard to resources, I think that certainly the DODIG has sufficient resources to fulfill the audit mission that we have. There is no lack of opportunities for us to audit, and because we always end up at the end of every year with more audits than we have staff for, so we have to roll some options forward and do them in subsequent years. I think the Department is dedicating a lot of resources to improving financial management, and I think it's important to note that. To make real sustainable progress in financial management, I think more resources may have to be dedicated to that in the future. And that is a question that the senior leadership in the Department are going to have to wrestle with. How much can they afford to put in this area versus other areas? As regard to accountability, I agree with some of the statements that you made. It is very difficult to hold people accountable in the Federal Government. We oftentimes find that when we get in and do our audits and we zero in on the office or the person that was responsible, we've found that they left. They've retired. They've gone to another job. But what we're doing is making a more concerted effort starting in this fiscal year in our audit reports to include recommendations that the Department review the actions of specific individuals and take appropriate action as necessary to hold people accountable.
Thank you, Mr. Blair. And so you said we have the resources, but it's because maybe the person's moved on. And I think we should work together to help identify maybe the systemic challenges, the process. And one thing that's somewhat unique to the military is, every time I meet a senior officer, for example, I say, well, how long are you going to be here in Hampton Roads? Well, 2 years. And I've known that every time, let's say you hire somebody to fix a department, the first thing they say is, well, boy, what I inherited was really, but I'll fix it for you. And then they move on. So I wonder if we should consider for these positions keeping them in the job 6 years and 8 years, and to build a base to where they could be held accountable in the most positive sense of the word. And I would like to circle back around. We'll do this offline. My time's running out here. But I'd really like to know the names of some of these companies who have just had these egregious examples of overcharging, because if you really circle back around, every dollar that's spent for a golf outing in Paris and France and Singapore, I'm sure there's a young Lance Corporal in Helmand Province that could use a little more support. So we need to go after these guys and hold them accountable, and if they steal from us, put them in jail. And conversely, the people who are doing a good job, we promote them. And I just want to build more of that culture in our government. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Scott. Rob?
Thank all the witnesses. Mr. Khan, I want to get into your description of the violation in June 2010 involving the Army's overobligation of FY 2008 MPA Army appropriation, which Mr. Conway and I have others written a letter about to try to get some more information. Now, I know that we don't have the facts yet on this, so I'm not asking you to draw a conclusion, but I'm asking you to generate some hypotheses as to how this might happen based upon your experience. My understanding is what happens here is that it is discovered, you eventually discover, that there's a $200 million transfer by the DOD from the working capital fund to the Army MPA fund. Mm-hmm. Is that what happens?
That's correct.
And then you say, well, gee, why did this transfer happen? And essentially the answer is, well, because we over-obligated the MPA fund by $200 million, right? Now, is something wrong with that? Is that what happened?
That is in process. I think that there was using their transfer authority to transfer money. At the time, I think the Army's perspective was that they knew that they needed that money. They had not already over-obligated. That is their perspective, but that's under investigation right now.
Okay, so it's not established that they over-obligated the $200 million.
It is being investigated right now. I think.
Let me just say this: right. Assuming that that was the case, and it may not be, but assuming it was the case, what hypotheses could you generate, Mr. Khan, as to why that happened?
I think it has been established that it was over-obligated.
Whether it has or hasn't,
yes.
If it were true,
right.
Typically, what might the reasons be that something like that would happen?
I mean, pure and simple, there was a lack of communication between the Army Budget Office and the Program Office. The Army Budget Office was using estimates, or what is known as bulk obligations, on a different set of projections than what was actually taking place in the field. This is going back to 2008 when there was an uptick in recruitment, fuel costs were going up. However, the budget estimates that the Army Budget Office was using was still using old numbers. So consequently, there was a mismatch.
So they're assuming that they can hire people and move them around in vehicles at a cost that's actually too low. So
that's correct.
They hire too many people and they drive too many miles and they overexpend the count by $200 million.
And it was specifically related to permanent change of stations, PCS moves, mm-hmm. where they are moving people around the country, mm-hmm. and there was an uptick in that also.
Now, this is not a rhetorical question, but how does that happen? I mean, and I think that goes to Mr. Gell's question, that somebody was figuring this out, assuming, $2 gasoline instead of $4 gasoline. Who did that, and how did it happen? Do we know?
It's a flaw in the estimation process, and really underlying that is a lack of connection, lack of a good process which connects where the estimates are being created and where the actual expenses are taking place.
But in plain English, doesn't somebody say, gee, that you estimated someone's going to drive fill their tank with 20 gallons last week, and you estimated it was going to cost $40, and it costs $80. I mean, doesn't somebody somewhere along the way figure that out and say, I wonder if all these projections are therefore flawed? How can you make $200 million worth of that mistake? Anybody want to take a whack at that one? That is a rhetorical question.
There's no good answer to that. I think someone should have known. Those accounts, number one, I think, are basically viewed as an entitlement. In other words, we're supporting the mission, we're managing them centrally, and we are executing them decentrally without good connectivity. We've had MilPERS, ADAs across the board.
No one's questioning that when someone has a permanent change of station, that their family should be moved. They should get all of it. Is an entitlement, absolutely. Sure. But that's not the issue. The issue is whomever is calculating the cost of the moving van, the other stuff that's going on, is wildly out of whack here. And I think it goes to the earlier question about accountability. I would ask that, consistent with the privacy obligations of the department, with the chairman's consent, that you give us a blow-by-blow of what investigation took place Who was held accountable for that decision and what happened to them? Again, consistent with your Privacy Act obligations. I think we'd like to know that to kind of see what happened here. I would yield back on that.
Mr. Andrews, I just want to one point that in DOD there's a lot of estimates, and estimates are not a bad thing as long as they're trued up. It's not a perfect system. It's like Chairman Conaway had mentioned, it's a large and complex organization with antiquated systems. So estimating.
Well, let me ask just one quick follow-up, if I could, and I should know this answer. The $200 million is off a base of how large of an account? How large is that account?
43 million. It's around 43 million. I'm sorry, 43 billion.
Okay, so $4.4 billion is 10% of the account, and $400,000 is $400 million is 1% of the account. So this is 1/2 of 1%. I mean, that's a small number, but that's a pretty big number, 1/2 of 1%. I mean, that's more than a rounding. That's outside the standard deviation, I would think, for an account that size. I mean, that's my.
It's material.
Yeah, it is material. It's 1/2 of 1%, but on a $43 billion account, that's pretty serious money. So I think we would like that kind of report, again, consistent with your Privacy Act obligations.
All right. Thanks, Rob. And we'll reward bad behavior on our side. Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate y'all coming out this morning. I think y'all know this is a extremely difficult job and an important issue that we're going to, it's pretty difficult to implement, but it's not impossible. And that's what we're here to keep putting the pressure on everybody to make sure it becomes a reality. I have some stock questions, but my colleagues brought up some points that I'm going to kind of deviate from. I'll just submit those for the record or something. When we're talking about ERP, I've never met an ERP that actually was on time, within budget, and to the owner's satisfaction. Can you kind of tell me, have y'all had any success stories where we've had an IT integration that actually worked? And who actually comes up with these timelines? I'm sure it's probably a joint between the person, the consultant selling this service and this product, and the owner that's wanting to purchase it. But why does it always seem that's where our time slippage comes from? Is it just unrealistic expectations, or is it just it's one of those things that you can just never grasp, and this is going to become a reality for all ERP implementations? And we'll start with Mr. Easton and move
I think it's a combination of things. I think that we have typically unrealistic schedule estimates, overestimates when it comes to savings associated with those. We don't spend enough time up front in terms of really thinking through the changes in the business that we need to make prior to implementing. And so as a result, I think that, and at the same time, we have a tendency not to want to stop. In other words, once we're going on the wrong direction, we should stop. The one example that I would say has been, in general, more successful has been the DLA Enterprise Business System, in which case they did have to make several starts and stops, and they incremented on small scales, and I think in general that tended to be more successful. But your track record that you point out, I think both within the government as well as private sector, is accurate.
I would have to agree with much of what Mr. Easton said. The department is the one who sets the milestone dates, and those dates are often driven by a lot of external factors. The 2017 date, I think, is putting a lot of pressure on the interim milestone dates, especially as it relates to the ERPs. As we go through and audit the ERPs and we identify problems, we oftentimes make recommendations that the department not further implement the system until the problems are addressed. To this point, I've not seen where the department has weighed in on the side of caution. Rather, they more frequently push forward with implementation with the idea that they're going to fix it later. And I'm not aware of any success stories, as you asked earlier, about ERPs being done on time and within cost or schedule. I think this is a very consistent challenge that the department has to address.
Thank you.
Sir, like you had pointed out, ERPs are a challenge to implement even in a commercial environment. ERP software is very sensitive, it's very complicated, so it has to be done right. There are three observations that we have, GAO has, as far as ERP implementations. within the DoD environment. The first one is requirements. It's critical that the upfront, like Mr. Easton had mentioned, the upfront user requirements are correctly identified so that additional work, slippages do not come about in terms of modifying the software once you begin to implement that. So that's critical. The other one is, like I had mentioned before, that there are several legacy systems within DoD. They have got data which has to be fed into the ERPs. Data conversion is a challenge. It is unwieldy. I mean, it has to be done somehow, but that is also a cost of slippages. And third one, which is linked to the antiquated systems, the legacy systems, is the interface. How the older systems, some of them, they can't be pulled away like MOCAS, at least in the near term. They have to interface with the ERPs, and that can really complicate matters.
So I'm kind of running out of time. Real quick, if there is a repeat offender, someone that's constantly overcharging the government, what mechanism do we have in place? One, and real quick, and whoever's the resident expert can pick this, to actually seek reimbursement, and also how do we debar federal contractors from doing business with the federal government? That's a loaded question.
This is beyond. This is a little bit beyond my area of expertise, but I think that was what I was going to say. There are legal procedures that we can take relative to debarment. We can serve and to be able to recover those and offset those costs to be able to be able to get that money back, because frequently we're doing business multiple times with the same people. But we aggressively go after those folks and then use the contract administration folks to be able to take the legal action as appropriate. And I defer.
Well, I'm out of time, but thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Stephen. The Department reported in 2010 improper payments of about $1.069 billion. Half of that, though, was in personnel or military pay. Are you walk us through? There's certain areas, I guess, like commercial pay, which is not represented in that list of 5, you'd expect problems with, but you'd think you get the pay right. So what's in that $500 million number? In
general, I think that we do get the pay right the vast majority of times. Many of those improper payments are, in fact, underpayments. We get situations, particularly there's 2 situations I would point out. In other words, we'll report payments based on information that we don't have. Members have not provided us information. Say if they get married, that they're entitled to basic housing allowance at a particular thing. If we don't have that information, there's a lag. In other words, until we get that information, and so when we actually are able to catch up, we pay that.
Would that be considered an improper payment?
Yes.
Even though you're not. Okay.
Absolutely. Right. And so, I mean, that is we did not pay that on time, and so we keep track of those things. The other thing, from a military personnel perspective, sort of reserve leave in terms of when reservists go on and off of active duty and their leave, has to catch up, and that's recorded as an improper payment. Okay. We pay, I'd say 97%. On time, but still, and Mr. Andrews raised a question, these are big dollars that are reflected, but it's an ongoing relationship. Okay. We recover money quickly, and we catch up quickly if we've underpaid.
Well, I guess I'd put those in 2 different categories. If a member hasn't reported something to you, and you've got a back pay for something, I wouldn't put that in the improper payment category because you didn't know. Anyway, we can talk about that one. Looking at the problem disbursements, we've got a chart from April 2011. Which shows for unmatched disbursements a total of $111 million, almost ununderstandable descriptor called negative unliquidated obligations. I have no clue what that means, but it's $10 million. 0 for the Air Force, by the way, so congratulations, Air Force, whoever's out there have it. Anyway, and then aged in transit, the float. When you say aged, what's the date on that aging?
Over 60 days.
So over 60 days. Why is the Army so much bigger in their unmatched disbursements than everybody else?
A primary driver right now is the implementation of their ERP, GFIBS, the General Funds Enterprise Business System that they're implementing. That is driving a significant number of unmatched disbursements, and these are disbursements that are recorded. And if the Army were here, they would say that in some cases they disagree. they would disagree with the reporting number. We're in the process of trying to sort that out. That's been a long-standing, as I look back on the reports that have been made on improper payments, it gets into some of the cataloging issues.
So how often do you pull that report?
Every month.
Every month?
Every month.
So at some point you would expect the Army to catch up and that number to drop.
Absolutely.
When they get the GFIBs.
And we put that in the fire plan because we want people to be tracking those. We want people to understand why we are making these changes, and not just systems changes, but control changes towards auditability. It should begin to reflect in those statistics.
All right. Mark, in your statement, let me see here, you're talking about funds balance for Treasury. You said that they're not recorded or were improperly recorded either at Treasury or in our general ledger. How would they get improperly recorded at Treasury?
They would be. They should be recorded correctly at Treasury.
Right.
So I may not have. In other words, by the time that disbursement, oftentimes does not get back and reconciled into the particular chart of accounts where the transaction was initiated. That's really the key. In other words, oftentimes the transactions will, in fact, be recorded at Treasury, but at an appropriation level. But what we need to do is to record it into the individual account and chart of accounts.
Help me understand. I guess I had assumed that Treasury was just your bank, and the bank didn't really care. As long as you had money in there, they would clear the transactions in and out. What is the recording that goes on at Treasury within an appropriation category? Is it just why is it that you're reconciling over there?
In other words, we are reconciling with Treasury, and Treasury has the transaction recorded in the vast majority of times. And so, if I may have misspoke on that particular issue,
that's fine. What happens at year end? We're on a cash basis, and we've got all these transactions out there that we're not sure about. How does that get reflected in the financial statements that we'll soon be seeing November 15-ish?
The transactions are reflected, and in some cases in an undistributed category. And so I think in the financial statements, and I can get back to you with specifics, they would offset receivables and payables, and I defer. I think that my fellow. I think that would be how they would be recorded, but they would be disclosed. Those quantities would be disclosed in the footnotes.
All right. All right. We'll go a second round. Rob, you got any question?
I really don't have a second round question, but just want to comment that. Well, I guess I would ask each panelist to comment on this. That if you had to identify the greatest impediment towards zeroing out these improper payments, if we could only do one thing, what's the thing that you would have us do to zero out the improper payments? What do you think, Mr. Easton?
I think the internal control emphasis is really what we need. I mean, systems clearly creates a lot of the problems, and the issue of accountability that you raised, I think the environment makes it very, very difficult to specifically hold people accountable, but we need to do a better job of that as well. But internal controls and making sure that we get the people to focus on those controls.
Mr. Blair, what do you think?
I agree with some of what Mr. Easton said, but I want to add a little more specificity to it. I think the internal controls are key, and there's some specific things that I think need to be done. More importantly, you need to do an in-depth analysis of all of the disbursements so you have a better idea of where your payments are going. But there has to be controls over all of the payments. Some of the things that I cited in my testimony, the examples, those are examples where there's oftentimes an inadequate or absent review process over the payments that are made, those contract invoices that are paid. And that's a specific control.
Referring to the commercial payment problem?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Mr. Kahn, what do you think?
I just want to say that two important elements, like I've mentioned in my oral statement, funds control and payments control, they have to be strengthened if we have to reach auditability. And another point I just want to bring out that both funds control and payments control originate in non-financial areas. Typically, they originates in procurement. So it is critical in terms of, accountability. Responsibility has to be taken by other functions. It all ends up in financial management where it has to be corrected, but procurement has to have the training to be able.
We don't want to create a shoot the messenger problem.
Exactly.
Where the financial people are actually doing their job, reporting the problem, we want to get to the source of why the problem was created in the first place. I do understand that. Thank you very much.
I did have one thing. That there was a bit of a disagreement between on the commercial pay category for estimating improper payments. Mr. Khan, your team had a vision or view that was different than what the Department of Defense had. Did y'all reconcile that? Are you comfortable now that those are being estimated improper payments, that you're using the right methodology?
I mean, yes. I mean, the commercial pay was not picked up for 2010, and based on what the comptroller, Mr. Hale, has recently said, that commercial pay is going to be picked up for estimating improper pays.
We're going to continue. The difference of opinion, and at the time, and it was a GAO report in 2008 or 2009, I believe, we were complying with the OMB guidance at the time. Subsequent legislation in Imperial made it very, very clear that we want you to do statistical sampling to be able to support those estimates. But I want to make sure that we're clear that there's a significant amount of prepayment checks that we do. In fact, we emphasize, this is why I wanted to emphasize the people aspect. I mean, we put a lot of people and a lot of eyes on it, but admittedly, much like everything, it's a team sport, and so it goes to the contracting officer, contract administration, contract audit. There's a lot of aspects to be able to do that, but that's the key issue, and I think we've resolved it.
Good. Just one quick, Mark, you mentioned that the internal control would be owned by you in 2017. I would posit that the internal control is owned by management today.
Absolutely. No, and I didn't want to.
I misunderstood that, because
I meant. I guess the key issue that I would have, and we have this discussion with my colleagues all the time. Too often, and this gets into the people and the culture. We've relied on the auditors to come in and tell us what the issues are, sort of detective controls. Back in 1982, even going back to 1950, if I look at the GAO report. Clearly, management has to assume responsibility. And so what I would want, and we had a recent case where when talking about the improper payments, high dollar value that were reported, management should have done a more aggressive job, saying this is why we feel the way we feel, as opposed to waiting for the auditors to come in. It's a change in mindset, and it's something that goes along, that management responsibility that is associated with the audit is something that we've got to change.
All right, thank you. Gentlemen, thank you for coming this morning. I want to thank my panel members as well. Anything? All right. Mark, Daniel, Asif, any final comments? All right. Thank you, boys. We're adjourned.